Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up in a land where every hour could mean danger or death? In ancient Nubia, life was never certain. Cities were constantly at war, slaves were captured and traded, and even a simple trip to fetch water could turn into a struggle for survival. Today, we will follow one person's harrowing journey through a single day in Nubia, a day so perilous that most outsiders would not survive it. Before we start our story about ancient Nubia, get into bed more comfortably, relax, you can turn on white noise in the background for more relaxation. Also, don't forget to support me with a like and a subscription. I'm always curious about where and at what time people are listening to me, write in the comments. Sweet dreams. The first rays of the Nubian sun barely pierced the horizon when I awoke, already trembling with the anticipation of danger. The city of Kerma was not yet alive with the clamor of merchants and children, but the distant sounds of shouting and the rhythm of war drums carried across the dusty streets. Smoke curled from a neighbor's hut, black and pungent, a warning that raiders had struck again last night. In Nubia, every sunrise was a reminder, survival was never guaranteed, and death often arrived uninvited. I swung my legs off the simple reed mat that served as my bed and pulled on a worn linen tunic. The fabric was coarse against my skin, but it was all I had. My possessions were few, a small clay jar, a thin wooden knife, and a bundle of dried figs and millet. Even food was a fragile comfort here, never certain, always at risk of being stolen or destroyed in some sudden raid. I paused for a moment, listening to the city waking up around me, the clatter of pots, the low hum of prayers at the temple, the distant neigh of a horse. Each sound reminded me that vigilance was as essential as air itself. Stepping into the narrow streets, I immediately felt the tension that hung over the city like a thick, suffocating veil. Merchants were arranging their stalls, shouting in harsh voices to attract customers, yet every eye darted nervously to the walls. Guards moved with purposeful strides, their spears and shields reflecting the rising sun, scanning for anyone who seemed out of place. Parents clutched the hands of children and whispered hurried warnings. Young men practiced their archery in quiet corners, their faces taut with fear, knowing that a call to arms could come at any moment. Life here was a perpetual act of balancing normalcy with the constant threat of violence. I made my way toward the northern well, keeping to the shadows where possible. Along the way, I witnessed the consequences of last night's chaos. A young man, barely older than I, was being dragged through the streets in iron chains. His face was pale, eyes wide with panic, lips trembling as he pleaded silently with the indifferent guards. Slavery was the foundation of our city's economy, and no amount of begging could spare someone from the cruel fate of capture. I forced my gaze away, forcing myself to focus on my own survival. Witnessing suffering every day could dull the heart, or else break it entirely. Passing the marketplace, I noticed the subtle signs of a city under siege from both within and without. Merchants whispered furtively about rumors of approaching armies from rival city-states, each vying for control of fertile land and river access. Women carried jars of water with care, frequently glancing over their shoulders, aware that a sudden attack could leave them defenseless. Children ran in tight groups, laughing and screaming as if trying to keep the fear at bay, yet their eyes betrayed a knowledge far beyond their years: danger could strike even in play. The air itself was heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and roasting meat, mingling with the stench of unwashed streets. At the well, I filled my jar with water, murky and warm, the only liquid that would sustain me through the morning. A woman nearby whispered about her husband, conscripted to fight in a distant battle, perhaps never to return. Families were torn apart daily, husbands, sons, and brothers could vanish overnight, taken by raiders, armies, or the harsh river floods that claimed lives without warning. I tightened my grip on the jar and began the cautious walk back through the alleys, aware of every sound and shadow. Each step could be fatal, even a glance the wrong way, the wrong face at the wrong time, could lead to a life spent in chains, or a body left unburied in the dust. The sun climbed higher, yet the city's energy was tense rather than lively. The hammering of construction echoed from newly built fortifications, a constant reminder that walls were the only thin barrier between life and death. A sudden shout startled me, guards had spotted someone moving suspiciously. I pressed myself against a wall, breath shallow, heart pounding, praying they would not notice me. Around me, life in Nubia continued, but each moment carried the shadow of mortality. In this city, being cautious was as essential as breathing, and even that did not always suffice. Survival was not guaranteed, and every day was a delicate negotiation with fate itself. By the time I returned to my small dwelling, the sun was fully above the horizon. I rested only briefly, knowing that the day had only begun, and threats would arrive from all directions: raiders from rival cities, slavers seeking new captives, disease lurking in stagnant water, and the ever-present threat of famine. Each hour would be a challenge, each step a test of wit, strength, and luck. In Nubia, life was a continuous gamble, and death was always a roll of the dice away. The narrow alleys led me toward the southern quarter, where the city's pulse felt both familiar and dangerous. Here, the buildings pressed close together, their mud bricks sun-baked and cracked. Each doorway seemed to hide secrets, some benign, some lethal. I moved carefully, aware that even a neighbor's quarrel could escalate into violence spilling into the street. A sudden clang of metal made me jump. A blacksmith was already at work, hammering a piece of iron with a rhythm that echoed like distant war drums. In Nubia, every sound carried a story, every movement a potential threat. As I walked, I passed a small temple where priests tended to a flickering oil lamp. Their chanting was quiet but persistent, a prayer against disease, death, and the raids that plagued our city. Superstition and ritual were inseparable from daily life. People believed that the gods could protect them from the marauding soldiers and slavers, though in truth, most prayers went unanswered. I offered a silent nod, my own thoughts preoccupied with survival, not devotion. My stomach growled, a reminder that hunger was as constant a threat as the city's human dangers. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near a marketplace stall. I saw two men wrestling over a small sack of grain, their faces red with anger and desperation. Food in Nubia was scarce and precious. What could not be defended was easily stolen. A child watching from the edge of the crowd cried out, and the vendors shouted, trying to regain control, but the scuffle ended abruptly when a guard appeared, his spear pointing toward the fighters. The men froze, their faces masking fear with anger. One wrong movement, one misstep, and both could be dragged away to labor or worse. I quickened my pace, realizing that even witnessing such events could put me in danger. Guards sometimes punished bystanders, suspecting them of complicity. Crossing the central square, I noticed the walls of the northern gate were swarming with activity. Soldiers drilled tirelessly, while scouts returned with news of approaching raiding parties. Rumors spread like wildfire. Rival city-states were fighting over fertile land along the Nile, and entire villages had been burned in the past week. Fear gripped the crowd, but life had to go on. Merchants shouted their wares, children played with sticks pretending they were spears, and women carried baskets of dates and dried fish, their movements quick and purposeful. The city's heartbeat was frantic yet fragile, teetering between normalcy and chaos. I ducked into a narrow alley to avoid being seen by a pair of soldiers who might question my presence. My legs shook, but I forced them steady, aware that running could draw attention. Shadows were my allies, yet even they offered no true protection. Every corner might conceal a raider, a thief, or an enforcer of the city's brutal laws. A few stray dogs barked, their teeth bared, chasing one another in a frenzy. Their noise made me realize that even animals had to adapt to survival here. There was no innocence in Nubia. Life itself was conditioned by the harshness of the land and the unrelenting threat of human cruelty. Reaching the banks of the Nile, I paused to drink and wash my face. The river was a lifeline, yet it also brought danger, crocodiles, disease, and the ever-present risk of ambush. Fishermen worked along the shore, their nets bobbing in the current, eyes scanning constantly for threats. I observed them silently, envying their cautious rhythm, wishing I could blend so seamlessly into the dangers around me. But blending was never enough. Nubia demanded more than skill, it demanded luck, cunning, and endurance. A single miscalculation could erase a lifetime of careful movement in a matter of seconds. As the sun climbed higher, the heat pressed down, making the city shimmer in waves of dust and light. Sweat ran down my back, and the weight of the day ahead felt heavier with each step. I had already seen slavery, theft, fear, and violence before breakfast. The day was far from over, and the city had many more trials to throw my way. Each alley, each corner, each marketplace held the potential for disaster, and I knew I had to keep moving, keep alert, and keep surviving. The sun had risen fully, casting a relentless heat over the city streets. Sweat trickled down my forehead as I navigated the twisting alleys, each step measured and careful. The air was thick with dust and the scent of burning reeds from cooking fires. Even at this early hour, the city seemed alive with tension. Merchants called to one another in harsh voices, children darted between stalls, and guards moved in rigid formations, their eyes scanning for trouble. Every movement felt like a gamble. One misstep could draw the attention of a soldier or a patrolling raider. A sudden shout froze me in place. From the corner of my eye, I saw a group of men dragging a young woman down the street, her hands bound behind her back, her cries muffled by the chaos of the marketplace. She had been captured, likely to be sold into slavery. I felt a pang of fear and helplessness. No one could intervene, and to even glance at the guards could mark me as a witness, a potential threat. Life in Nubia was brutally indifferent, and survival meant turning away from the suffering of others, no matter how unbearable it felt. I ducked behind a stack of clay jars, my heart hammering. The crowd flowed around the scene, eyes averted, pretending not to see. A child tugged at its mother's skirt, whimpering, and the woman whispered reassurances that carried no comfort. Every sound, every glance, reminded me that danger was omnipresent. The raids between city-states were relentless, and the threat of enslavement loomed over every resident like a shadow. Even simple tasks, fetching water, delivering goods, or walking to a friend's home, required caution and constant vigilance. Continuing my journey, I approached the southern gate, where soldiers drilled with relentless precision. Their spears struck the sunlit stone rhythmically, echoing down the streets. News had arrived of another raid along the river, where a neighboring settlement had been pillaged, men killed, and women taken. Rumors spread quickly, people whispered in tight circles, fear evident in their expressions. Families huddled together, ensuring that children remained close, while merchants secured their goods with hurried knots and locks. In Nubia, the law of survival overshadowed law and order, and every day demanded cunning, speed, and luck. I stopped briefly at a small well near the riverbank. The water was murky but necessary. As I cupped it in my hands and drank, I watched fishermen casting nets along the Nile, their faces lined with caution. Even they were not immune to the perils of the river. Crocodiles lurked beneath the surface, disease thrived in the stagnant pools, and raids along the riverbank were frequent. Each day required vigilance not just on land but also along the waterways that sustained us. I refilled my small clay jar, knowing it would be my lifeline for the hours ahead. Turning away from the river, I moved toward the center of the city, where the marketplace's chaotic energy had grown. Arguments erupted over prices, and a few desperate men attempted to steal bread and dried fish. A sudden crash drew my attention. An overturned cart spilled its contents into the street, sending a cloud of dust and grain scattering. The vendor shouted furiously, his voice carrying over the din, and a guard struck one of the thieves with a heavy stick. The man fell, groaning, and the crowd parted reluctantly, as if to acknowledge the fragile dominance of law in a city teetering on the edge of chaos. Each step I took reminded me that Nubia offered no guarantees. Disease lurked unseen in the water, in the food, in the crowded homes. Wounds from a careless step or a skirmish could fester into death. Each glance over my shoulder carried the possibility of capture, and each encounter with a stranger required instant judgment. I moved with care, avoiding eye contact with soldiers, raiders, and merchants alike. My survival depended on invisibility, on blending into the throng, on the quiet skill of moving unnoticed through a city that seemed always ready to erupt into violence. As the sun climbed higher, the city's streets became a furnace, forcing those who could to seek shade under awnings and in narrow alleys. I pressed myself against a cool mud wall, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of the day pressing down. Already I had witnessed the cruelty of slavery, the theft and desperation of the marketplace, and the constant fear that every corner, every shadow, could conceal death. And yet, the day was far from over. Nubia demanded vigilance, and the hours ahead promised new dangers, each more perilous than the last. I knew that to survive until nightfall would require not just caution, but cunning, endurance, and luck beyond measure. By midday, the sun had climbed high, beating down mercilessly on the city's mud-brick streets. The heat shimmered above rooftops, creating mirages that made distant alleys look like pools of water. My steps slowed, weighed down by exhaustion and the relentless awareness that danger could strike at any moment. The city's rhythm had shifted, the marketplace was noisier now, but the laughter and bargaining carried an undertone of tension. In Nubia, joy and fear often walked side by side, inseparable companions in every street and home. As I moved cautiously toward the western quarter, I heard raised voices and the sound of heavy boots on stone. Peering around a corner, I saw a squad of armed men dragging a group of captives through the street. Men, women, and even children, their hands bound with rough ropes, were being herded toward a transport cart. The captives' faces were pale and terrified, eyes wide with disbelief and despair. One woman stumbled, and a soldier struck her with the flat of his spear, forcing her back to her feet. My stomach churned with fear. In Nubia, the line between freedom and slavery was measured in a single glance, a single misstep, a single unfortunate encounter. I pressed myself against the cool wall of a nearby building, trying to make myself as small and unnoticed as possible. My heartbeat roared in my ears, loud enough that I feared it would betray my presence. The streets, crowded with people trying to continue their daily routines, seemed to part around the captives like water around a stone. Even the children, playing with sticks and clay figures, paused to watch the parade of suffering. I forced my eyes away, reminding myself that attention could be deadly. To survive, I needed invisibility more than courage. Continuing my cautious journey, I passed a small alley where the scent of smoke and roasting meat mingled with the dust and sweat of the city. A man sat cross-legged outside his home, sharpening a spear while keeping one wary eye on the street. His posture was relaxed yet tense, a balance learned only through experience. Survival in Nubia demanded constant vigilance, even those who appeared calm were calculating risk at every step. I nodded silently to him, understanding that we shared a quiet acknowledgement of the dangers that surrounded us, though our paths would likely never cross beyond that. Further along, I noticed a group of children huddled near a collapsed wall. They whispered stories of raiders and rival city-states, of entire villages destroyed in the night. Their voices were low, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Even at such a young age, they understood that life in Nubia was a constant gamble. Every day brought uncertainty, disease lurking in stagnant water, famine threatening the weak, raiders seeking slaves, and the city-state armies marching over distant hills. It was a world where innocence was fleeting, and survival was measured in careful choices rather than strength or skill alone. As I reached the riverbank once more, I paused to drink, my lips cracked and dry from the sun. The Nile, lifeline of our people, was both protector and predator. Fishermen worked carefully along the shore, their eyes constantly scanning for crocodiles, the river's stealthy killers. Disease also lingered in the water, a single sip or a minor cut could lead to fever and death. I dipped my clay jar and drank cautiously, aware that my body depended on this fragile gift, yet each moment of respite was brief, for the city was far from safe. A shout from the far end of the street drew my attention. A skirmish had broken out between two rival gangs of young men, fighting over food, coin, or pride. Stones flew, sticks crashed against shields, and the air was thick with dust and panic. Innocent bystanders scattered, screaming and dodging debris. I slipped into a shadowed doorway, pressing myself against the cool mud wall. My heart pounded, witnessing conflict could be as dangerous as participating. A single misstep might mark me for suspicion or retaliation. In Nubia, survival required not just strength, but foresight, caution, and a constant awareness of the chaos around you. By the time I finally moved on, the sun was high above, casting deep shadows along narrow streets. My body was weary, my senses taut with vigilance, yet the day was far from over. Nubia did not allow rest or complacency. The hours ahead would bring further dangers, rival raiders, disease, the ever-present threat of capture, and perhaps even betrayal from someone I trusted. Each moment demanded attention, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The heat of the day pressed down on the city with relentless intensity. My steps slowed, weighed down not only by exhaustion but by the unending awareness of danger lurking at every corner. The streets of Kerma seemed alive with a tension that pulsed through every building, every market stall, and every alleyway. Children darted past, their laughter thin and nervous, while merchants shouted their wares with urgency sharpened by fear. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the next act of violence, the next raid, or the next collapse of order. As I navigated through the narrow alleys, I heard the sharp clatter of hooves and the familiar sound of armored boots on stone. A patrol of city soldiers passed, their eyes sweeping across the crowd. One glance in the wrong direction, one hesitation, and a civilian could easily become a suspect, or worse, a target for forced labor. I pressed myself against a wall, trying to blend into the shadows, feeling the sweat running down my back and the dust coating my skin. Survival in Nubia was not merely about avoiding immediate threats, it was about predicting them, anticipating the movements of others, and moving with absolute discretion. Turning a corner, I saw a scene that made my stomach tighten. A group of raiders had broken into a small home, dragging out a family that had tried to hide in the upper rooms. The mother clutched her youngest child while a soldier shoved the father to the ground, binding his hands behind his back. Their screams filled the alleyway, muffled only slightly by the chaotic noise of the market nearby. There was no time to help, no way to intervene. In Nubia, compassion often meant death, the only path to survival was invisibility and silence. I hurried past, forcing my gaze downward and my heart to steady itself. The riverbank called to me, offering a brief reprieve from the suffocating streets. Here, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of water and reeds. Fishermen worked diligently, casting their nets with practiced precision, while their eyes never left the dark water. Even in this moment, danger was not absent, crocodiles lurked beneath the surface, disease threatened those who touched the river, and raiders could strike with little warning from boats on the opposite bank. I knelt to drink, savoring the small relief, knowing that this pause would be fleeting. The city and its dangers would not wait for me to rest. As I moved away from the river, I encountered a small band of merchants arguing violently over a spilled basket of dates. The confrontation escalated quickly, hands grabbed knives, stones flew, and shouts pierced the air. People scattered, some fleeing for safety, others frozen in fear. I ducked behind a nearby stall, my ears ringing from the chaos. In Nubia, the line between life and death could be measured by seconds. A careless glance, a wrong step, or a misplaced word could be fatal. Every movement had to be calculated, every decision precise. Crossing into the western quarter, I noticed that the city's walls, recently reinforced, were busy with construction crews and soldiers. The constant threat of attack from rival city-states meant that defenses had to be maintained ceaselessly. Guards patrolled tirelessly, their spears gleaming in the sun, ready to strike at anyone deemed suspicious. Even in the midst of labor, the sense of urgency never faded. The knowledge that a raid could erupt at any moment weighed heavily on every resident. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion began to gnaw at me, but there was no relief. Food was scarce, water needed careful rationing, and the city offered no true sanctuary. I passed a group of children playing war games, sticks as spears, and mud bricks as shields. Their eyes were bright, but there was a seriousness beyond their years, a reflection of the constant threats surrounding them. In Nubia, childhood was fleeting, replaced quickly by the harsh lessons of survival, fear, and vigilance. The sun had reached its peak, and the heat radiated from every surface. I found a small shadowed corner to rest briefly, heart hammering, body trembling, and mind racing with the knowledge that the day was far from over. Danger was everywhere: raiders, disease, starvation, and the ever-present risk of enslavement. Each step I took, each choice I made, carried weighty consequences. Surviving this day would require not only courage but also cunning, endurance, and a constant awareness of the world around me. Nubia demanded nothing less than absolute vigilance, and even then, survival was never certain. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly, and the streets of Kerma were a furnace of dust, sweat, and tension. Every shadow seemed a potential hiding place for danger, and every footstep carried the possibility of drawing unwanted attention. I moved cautiously through the narrow alleys, my eyes constantly scanning for threats, my ears alert to the slightest noise. The city was alive with unrest, merchants argued violently over goods, children darted through crowds, and guards marched with practiced precision, their spears catching the light in sharp glints. Survival required not only speed and cunning but an almost unnatural awareness of everything around me. I had barely crossed the central square when I heard shouting behind me. I turned slightly and saw a small band of raiders charging through the streets, their faces twisted with aggression, weapons raised high. They were hunting for captives, young and old alike, to sell into slavery or use as leverage in the constant conflicts between city-states. Panic surged through the crowd. People screamed, scattering in all directions, while some froze, unable to comprehend the sudden threat. My heart raced as I ducked into a narrow passage, pressing myself against the wall, trying to become invisible. The raiders passed, their heavy boots pounding the ground, and I exhaled a shaky breath, knowing that one mistake could have meant immediate capture or death. Even in the safety of the alley, danger was not gone. The sound of cries and shouts echoed through the city, and the dust stirred by the raiders' charge hung in the air like a warning. I paused, trying to calm my racing pulse, knowing that moving too soon could draw attention from others, soldiers, bandits, or even desperate neighbors trying to protect their own. Nubia taught harsh lessons: every movement mattered, every decision could tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. As I crept toward the river, seeking both water and concealment, I passed a group of children huddled near a collapsed wall. They whispered about raids, families lost, and villages burned in distant lands. Fear and survival had etched themselves into their young faces, and their wide eyes followed me warily, assessing whether I was friend or stranger. I nodded silently, understanding their vigilance, and pressed on. Even at such a young age, they knew that life in Nubia required constant awareness and the ability to move unnoticed through a dangerous world. By the time I reached the banks of the Nile, the heat was nearly unbearable. The river offered a small respite, a chance to cool my face and quench my thirst, but danger remained. Crocodiles lurked in the water, disease thrived in stagnant pools, and raiders could strike from hidden boats along the opposite bank. I filled my clay jar with care, drinking slowly, savoring the brief reprieve, aware that the pause could not last long. Even as I rested, the city's chaos pressed in from behind, a constant reminder that survival was fleeting and fragile. Moving away from the river, I entered another part of the city where rumors of plague had begun to spread. People whispered about sudden fevers and swollen bodies, about those who had fallen ill and were left abandoned. Disease was as deadly as any raider or army in Nubia. A single infection could claim lives faster than a blade. I kept my distance from the sick, masking fear with composure, knowing that appearing weak or panicked could attract attention. In this city, vigilance was a shield, and caution was a weapon. The late afternoon brought no relief. Market stalls were crowded, arguments escalated into violence, and the city's walls echoed with the sound of training soldiers. Everywhere I looked, danger manifested: theft, aggression, illness, and the ever-present threat of slavery. I moved quietly, instinctively keeping to shadows and avoiding the gaze of anyone who might consider me prey. Each step was a negotiation with fate, a careful dance between caution and necessity. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the streets in harsh orange light, I paused briefly behind a low wall, exhausted and weary. The day had already been merciless: raids, near captures, disease, and the oppressive weight of the city's dangers pressed on me like a physical burden. Yet there were still hours left, and the day was far from over. Nubia did not forgive weakness or inattentiveness, and even the smallest lapse in awareness could be fatal. Survival required not just endurance but constant calculation, foresight, and the luck of moving unseen through a world ruled by violence and fear. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets of Kerma, stretching the shapes of mud brick buildings into distorted forms that seemed almost alive. Every shadow held the possibility of danger, every alley a potential trap. My body ached from the constant vigilance and the ceaseless movement required to survive this city. The marketplace, which had been noisy and chaotic earlier, now buzzed with a tense energy. Merchants were packing up goods, children clung tightly to their mothers, and soldiers moved with disciplined precision, scanning for threats that could appear at any moment. I had barely taken a few steps when a shout erupted from a nearby alley. Instantly, my heart pounded and adrenaline surged. A group of raiders, young men with cruel eyes and sharpened blades, had cornered an elderly man who was trying to carry a small basket of grain home. The man's hands shook as he raised the basket to protect himself, but the raiders laughed and shoved him to the ground, seizing the precious food. His cries echoed through the narrow passage, a sound that would haunt me even as I tried to ignore it. Survival demanded silence, invisibility, and the ability to move unnoticed. To intervene would have meant almost certain death. I pressed myself against the wall, willing myself to disappear. The raiders moved on, leaving the man to recover slowly, shaking and clutching what remained of his dignity. I exhaled silently and continued, my senses hyper-aware of every sound, the clatter of distant hooves, the low hum of conversation, the crackle of fires burning along the riverbank. Even the simplest task, walking to fetch water or returning home, was fraught with risk. The city was a labyrinth of threats, each corner, each doorway, each narrow passage potentially harboring enemies, disease, or sudden violence. Crossing into the southern quarter, I noticed a group of children playing war games with sticks and broken clay pots. Their laughter was sharp, almost strained, and their eyes darted nervously toward every passing adult. Even in play, the lessons of survival had been imprinted upon them. They understood that life in Nubia was not for the complacent or the careless. The harsh reality was clear, strength and skill mattered, but luck and timing often mattered even more. One careless step, one glance in the wrong direction, and a lifetime of freedom could end in chains. I moved toward the river once more, seeking the brief solace it offered. The Nile, glistening under the sun, was both lifeline and threat. Crocodiles waded beneath the surface, disease lingered in its murky waters, and raiders could appear suddenly along the banks. I cupped my hands and drank cautiously, feeling the cool water against my parched lips. For a moment, the city's chaos seemed distant, replaced by the hypnotic flow of the river. But even here, I knew safety was fleeting. From the corner of my eye, I saw soldiers approaching, a small patrol moving with deliberate steps, eyes scanning for trouble. I slipped into a shadowed doorway, holding my breath as they passed. One of the men glanced briefly in my direction, and my heart skipped a beat. Had he noticed me? The patrol moved on, and I exhaled slowly, grateful for the narrow escape. Survival in Nubia was a constant test of perception, stealth, and instinct. Each encounter, each narrow avoidance, was a victory in a world where victory was rare. As the sun dipped lower, the heat began to wane, but the city's dangers did not. A commotion erupted near the central square, another clash, this time between two rival gangs of young men, fighting over stolen goods and territory. Stones flew, sticks crashed, and the air filled with shouting. Innocent bystanders ran for cover, and I pressed myself against a wall, heart pounding, hoping to remain unseen. The line between observer and victim was thin, and today I had already walked that line more times than I could count. By evening, my body ached, my mind was exhausted, and yet the city offered no respite. The day had been filled with threats, raids, thefts, disease, and the constant, invisible weight of fear. Nubia demanded more than endurance, it demanded cunning, vigilance, and the ability to anticipate danger before it arrived. Even as the shadows lengthened and the sun began to sink toward the horizon, I knew the night would bring its own challenges, and survival would require every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The shadows of the evening crept across Kerma, stretching the narrow alleys into long, jagged lines that merged with the growing darkness. The heat of the day had faded slightly, but the city's tension remained thick, like smoke hanging over a fire. Every movement in the streets seemed magnified, every whisper carrying the potential to draw attention. I moved cautiously, each step measured, each breath deliberate. Even the quietest footfall could betray my presence to a passing soldier or a lurking raider. As I turned a corner, a sudden shout pierced the air. My heart leapt into my throat. Ahead, a group of raiders had cornered a young boy trying to steal fruit from a merchant's stall. The boy froze, eyes wide with panic, as the raiders advanced, grinning cruelly. One of them struck him with the flat of a sword, and the child stumbled, crying out. The crowd parted, unwilling or too afraid to intervene. I pressed myself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. In Nubia, mercy was a luxury, and survival often meant looking away while cruelty unfolded before your eyes. Moving on, I passed the remnants of a collapsed building near the riverbank. Its walls were blackened by fire, and a small family had clearly tried to take refuge there before being forced out. The father's tools were scattered across the ground, his wife's cloth torn and dust-covered. Children clutched to what little remained, their eyes haunted and wary. The sight reminded me that in this land, disaster could strike with the suddenness of a summer storm, leaving nothing behind but fear and ash. Every day in Nubia carried the same risk: raids, slavery, disease, famine, or violence could claim lives in moments. I approached the river to drink, but the usual tranquility was gone. A commotion had erupted near the fishermen's nets. A pair of raiders had leapt from a small boat, seizing both fish and supplies, threatening anyone who attempted to intervene. Crocodiles slid silently through the water, unseen predators waiting patiently. Disease lingered, invisible yet deadly. Even in this moment of desperate thirst, danger pressed in on all sides. I drank sparingly, knowing that lingering too long could attract attention or worse, plunge me into the hands of those who would enslave or kill without hesitation. Turning back toward the city, I noticed a patrol of soldiers blocking a narrow street. Their spears glinted in the last light of day, eyes sharp, scanning for trouble. I ducked into a nearby doorway, holding my breath as they passed. One soldier paused, tilting his head in my direction. I froze, heart hammering, until he continued on, oblivious to my presence. Such moments were the thin thread upon which life in Nubia hung: one glance, one hesitation, and survival could vanish. Further along, I encountered a small group of children, quietly sharing scraps of food. Their eyes, large and alert, followed my every move. Even at play, they carried the weight of the city's dangers. They understood what adults often tried to ignore: life here required constant vigilance. A single misstep could mean chains, blood, or death. I nodded silently at them, acknowledging the shared understanding that survival was never guaranteed, that every decision mattered. As darkness deepened, the city became quieter but not safer. Fires burned in small homes and cooking pits, casting flickering shadows that could conceal an enemy. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear. Every alley, every doorway, every shadow carried the potential for violence or death. I pressed on, moving carefully, knowing that the night would bring its own hazards: roaming thieves, hidden traps, disease, and the ever-present threat of capture. By the time I found a small corner to rest briefly, my body was exhausted, and my mind raced with the events of the day. I had witnessed raids, thefts, cruelty, disease, and near captures. Each moment had demanded vigilance, cunning, and the ability to move unseen through a world governed by danger. And yet, the day was not over. Nubia's nights were as treacherous as its days, filled with unseen threats, the cries of the captured, and the whisper of fate waiting to strike. Survival required endurance, instinct, and more than a little luck, and even then, life here offered no guarantees. Night began to descend over Kerma, wrapping the city in a deep orange glow that quickly faded to shadowy gray. The streets, which had buzzed with tension all day, now carried a quieter but no less deadly energy. Darkness amplified every threat. A single figure could hide in an alley and strike without warning. A misstep on uneven stone could draw the attention of soldiers or raiders alike. I moved cautiously, hugging the walls, trying to let the shadows swallow me whole. A sudden shout shattered the fragile calm. From a nearby alley, I glimpsed a pair of men struggling over a captured woman. The sound of her frightened cries, mixed with the harsh laughter of her captors, echoed through the narrow streets. One of the raiders raised his spear as the woman tried to resist, and I instinctively ducked behind a pile of clay pots, heart hammering. Survival in Nubia demanded invisibility. Stepping forward, speaking, or even glancing could bring death. I stayed still, counting my breaths, willing the chaos to pass without dragging me into it. The night was deceptive in its quiet. Even the simple act of moving through the city carried risk. As I crossed the central square, I noticed shadows flitting along the walls, children sneaking home from errands, merchants closing stalls, soldiers on patrol. Every face was a potential threat, every shadow, a hiding place. I had to anticipate movement, read intentions from fleeting glances, and react before danger arrived. One wrong step, one misread signal, could end the day here, in the dusty streets of Kerma. The riverbank offered a small promise of safety, though it too was fraught with danger. Crocodiles prowled silently beneath the water, waiting for the unwary. Disease lingered invisibly in every stagnant pool, every sip of unclean water. As I cupped my hands to drink, I glimpsed movement along the opposite bank, figures slipping through the shadows. Raiders? Scouts from rival city-states? I could not tell, but the awareness of their presence sent a chill through me. Even here, away from the crowded streets, survival required constant vigilance. Continuing my careful path, I entered a narrow alley that led toward the southern quarter. Fires flickered in homes and cooking pits, casting dancing shadows that made the familiar street seem alien and menacing. The smell of smoke, cooking, and dust mixed with the ever-present undertone of fear that pervaded the city. From a distance, I heard the low moans of the sick, and my stomach twisted at the reminder that disease was as lethal as any human threat in Nubia. One careless touch, one shared cup, one minor wound could be fatal. Suddenly, a young boy darted past me, clutching a stolen loaf of bread. His wide eyes met mine for a brief second, and I could see the raw terror in them. He was learning, as all children here did, that survival meant quick thinking, swift movement, and the ability to vanish when danger appeared. I allowed him a small nod of encouragement before continuing, careful to remain unseen. The patrols of soldiers moved relentlessly through the streets, their spears catching the last light of the sun. I crouched low behind a mud wall, heart hammering, as one soldier's gaze swept near me. Time stretched, every second unbearably long, until he finally moved on. Life in Nubia was a constant negotiation with chance. Every encounter was a test of perception, cunning, and timing. By the time I found a small, shadowed corner to rest briefly, exhaustion had settled into my muscles and mind. The day had been unrelenting: raids, theft, disease, violence, and the ever-present threat of capture. Yet even as the night deepened, I knew that the hours ahead would not offer true safety. Nubia did not forgive weakness. Survival required endurance, instinct, and a careful, unceasing awareness of the world. And even then, life here could be taken in a heartbeat. Night had settled fully over Kerma, draping the city in a heavy darkness that seemed almost tangible. The streets, once chaotic, were now quieter, but the stillness carried its own threats. Every shadow could conceal a predator, every sound, a cough, a footstep, a distant shout, could signal danger. My muscles ached from hours of tension and constant vigilance, yet there was no place to rest safely. In Nubia, even the night offered no true refuge. As I moved cautiously through a narrow alley, I heard voices approaching, low, gruff, and deliberate. Two men appeared, dragging a young woman between them. She struggled, crying out softly, but her captors ignored her. I flattened myself against the wall, heart hammering, willing the darkness to swallow me. Survival depended on invisibility. One glance, one movement, could mark me for death or enslavement. The men passed, unaware of my presence, and I exhaled a shaky breath, relieved yet aware that the next encounter could be fatal. I continued toward the riverbank, seeking the slight comfort of its presence. The Nile glimmered in the moonlight, deceptively calm. Crocodiles slid silently beneath the surface, their eyes glinting like dark jewels in the reflection of the moon. I knelt to drink cautiously, savoring the brief respite, knowing that even this moment carried risk. Disease lingered in every drop, every pool, an invisible predator waiting for carelessness. The river was a lifeline, but it was also a reminder that survival in Nubia demanded constant awareness and careful calculation. From the corner of my eye, I noticed movement along the opposite bank, figures slipping through the shadows. My pulse quickened. Were they raiders returning to the city? Scouts from a rival city-state? I could not tell, but the threat was real. I retreated slowly into the shadows, keeping low and silent. One misstep could expose me, and I would be trapped with no escape. Every instinct screamed to remain unseen, to anticipate every possibility, and to trust no one. The city streets themselves seemed alive with danger. Fires flickered in small homes, casting dancing shadows that transformed familiar alleys into unfamiliar mazes. The smell of smoke and cooking mingled with the underlying stench of unwashed streets, and the faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease was an ever-present threat. Even a minor wound, unnoticed until too late, could mean death. Every step through these streets was a negotiation with fate. Suddenly, a commotion erupted ahead. A small band of thieves had cornered a family, attempting to seize their meager possessions. The father struggled, raising a stick in defense, while the mother clutched her children to her chest. I pressed myself against a wall, holding my breath. Witnessing such brutality was terrifying, but stepping in would have meant certain death. Survival in Nubia required turning away from injustice, remaining invisible, and moving with calculated caution. I moved on, slipping through the alleys toward the southern quarter. The sounds of distant soldiers' boots echoed, their eyes sharp for anyone out of place. Every shadow, every figure, demanded instant judgment. One wrong glance, one hesitation, one misjudged step could mean capture or death. Even the quietest corners offered no guarantee of safety. By the time I found a small shadowed nook to rest briefly, the chill of the night had settled into my bones. My body trembled with exhaustion, my mind raced with the day's events, and the weight of survival pressed heavily on me. Raids, thefts, disease, cruelty, and the ever-present threat of slavery had made every moment a test of vigilance, endurance, and cunning. Nubia demanded constant awareness, and even then, life here was never certain. The night stretched ahead, filled with unseen dangers, waiting to claim the unwary, and I knew that surviving until dawn would require all my skill, luck, and resolve. The night deepened, and Kerma became a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The city streets, once teeming with anxious movement, were now eerily quiet, yet every alley and corner held the potential for danger. My legs ached from hours of vigilance, and my lungs burned from the constant, shallow breathing required to remain unnoticed. The air was heavy with smoke from cooking fires and the faint, acrid scent of dung and refuse. Even the familiar sounds of night, the croak of frogs, the rustle of rodents, the distant flap of bird wings, felt threatening in the darkness. I edged cautiously through a narrow lane toward the western quarter, hoping for a momentary reprieve. Every step required careful calculation, the wrong movement could attract the attention of soldiers or raiders lurking in the shadows. The knowledge of what I had already witnessed today, the captured women, the dragged men, the violence over food and possessions, made every heartbeat a reminder that Nubia offered no safety. Survival depended on invisibility, on intuition, on anticipating danger before it struck. As I rounded a corner, a sudden shout erupted from behind. I froze, heart hammering. 2 men had cornered a child, attempting to steal his basket of dates. The boy struggled, screaming softly, but the attackers ignored him, intent on their cruel task. I flattened myself against the wall, holding my breath as they passed. Every encounter carried lethal potential, the smallest distraction or wrong glance could cost life itself. In Nubia, the line between observer and victim was razor-thin. Moving on, I made my way toward the riverbank. The Nile reflected the pale moonlight, its surface deceptively calm. Crocodiles slid silently beneath, waiting, and the faint ripple of water could mask the approach of raiders or thieves. I knelt carefully, cupping my hands to drink, every muscle tensed. Even this simple act was a gamble. One careless movement could draw attention. One misjudged step, and the river could claim more than thirst. It could mean a deadly encounter with the predators, both human and animal. From the corner of my eye, I noticed figures moving along the far bank. My pulse quickened. Were they raiders returning from a recent pillage? Scouts from a rival city-state, watching for weakness? I could not tell. All I knew was that they were close enough to be dangerous. I retreated slowly into the shadows, body pressed against the cool mud wall, waiting, listening. Every instinct screamed to stay hidden, to anticipate every move, to trust no one. Nubia was unforgiving, and even the cautious could fall victim in an instant. Further along, the alleyways seemed to close in. Fires flickered in the distance, casting dancing shadows that turned familiar paths into a maze. The faint cries of the sick reached me, reminders that disease could strike faster than raiders ever could. Even the smallest wound, unnoticed until too late, could become a death sentence. Every step required vigilance, every breath measured, every glance calculated. I moved carefully, feeling the weight of the city pressing down around me. Suddenly, a scuffle broke out nearby. A group of thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to seize his wares. Sticks and knives clashed, shouts and cries echoing through the alleys. I froze against a wall, heart racing. Witnessing such brutality was terrifying, but to intervene would have been certain death. Survival required invisibility, cunning, and the ability to move through chaos without being noticed. By the time I found a small shadowed corner to rest, the chill of the night had settled into my bones. My body trembled with exhaustion, my mind replayed every danger of the day, and the burden of survival weighed heavily. Raids, thefts, disease, violence, and the omnipresent threat of slavery had made each moment a test of endurance, perception, and luck. Nubia demanded constant vigilance, and even then, life was never certain. The hours ahead promised more threats, and I knew that surviving until dawn would require every ounce of skill and instinct I possessed. The night had deepened into a dense, almost suffocating darkness. The city of Kerma, so chaotic in the daylight, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, where even familiar alleys seemed foreign and threatening. My muscles ached, and my skin prickled with the awareness that danger lurked in every corner. The faint glow of distant fires flickered across walls, casting monstrous shapes that seemed to move on their own. Every sound, the scuffle of a rat, the distant splash of the river, the muffled cry of a child, felt magnified, a potential signal of death or capture. I moved cautiously along the western quarter, hugging the walls, careful to remain unseen. The narrow streets were eerily quiet, yet each step carried risk. Soldiers patrolled relentlessly, their spears catching faint moonlight, their eyes sharp and uncompromising. A single glance in the wrong direction, one stumble, one miscalculated step could be fatal. The lessons of the day pressed heavily on me. Nubia was unforgiving, and survival required not only vigilance but instinct honed to a razor's edge. Suddenly, a shout rang out from a nearby alley. My pulse surged as I caught sight of a group of raiders cornering a family. The father raised a crude spear, desperate to protect his children, but the attackers pressed forward with cruel determination. The mother clutched her youngest to her chest, sobbing quietly. I pressed myself against the mud wall of a nearby building, holding my breath. There was no way to intervene, even glancing in their direction could have marked me as a threat. Survival demanded invisibility, discretion, and the grim acceptance of helplessness. The river beckoned once more, its dark waters reflecting the pale moon. I moved cautiously, ears straining for any sound that could indicate danger. Crocodiles slid silently beneath the surface, their presence a deadly reminder that even the life-giving river held threats. Disease lingered invisibly, carried in water, air, and even the smallest wound. I knelt to drink, aware that lingering too long, or showing weakness, could attract the attention of human predators. Every sip, every pause, was a gamble with life itself. From the corner of my eye, I noticed movement on the opposite bank. Figures slipped along the shadows, and I could not tell if they were raiders returning or scouts from rival city-states. My body tensed instinctively. One wrong step, one noise, and I could be trapped with no means of escape. The river, which had seemed a brief sanctuary, now felt like a thin line between life and death, a barrier that could just as easily be a trap. Further into the alleys, fires flickered from homes, casting shadows that shifted and stretched across the walls. The air was thick with smoke and dust, carrying the faint, unmistakable stench of sickness. I paused to listen to the low moans of the ill, a chilling reminder that disease could be as lethal as any blade or spear. Even the smallest cut, unnoticed until too late, could become a death sentence. Every step required caution, every glance assessment, every breath measured. A sudden scuffle drew my attention ahead. Thieves had cornered a merchant, trying to seize his goods in the shadowed alley. Sticks clashed against knives, shouts and cries reverberating through the narrow street. I pressed against a wall, heart racing. To intervene would be to invite death, to move too quickly could betray my presence. Survival in Nubia demanded patience, subtlety, and constant anticipation of danger. By the time I found a narrow, shadowed corner to rest briefly, the chill of the night had sunk deep into my bones. My body trembled from exhaustion, my mind replayed every encounter, every threat, every near miss. Raids, thefts, disease, cruelty, and the ever-present threat of slavery had made survival a matter of endurance, cunning, and luck. Nubia offered no forgiveness, and even the most careful observer could fall prey to fate. I knew the night still held dangers, and surviving until dawn would require every skill, instinct, and ounce of luck I possessed. The moon had climbed higher, casting a cold, silver light over Kerma. Shadows deepened in every alley, and the familiar streets now seemed alien and dangerous. Every step I took felt amplified, echoing in the stillness of the night. My body ached from hours of tension, my muscles stiff, and yet there was no time for rest. The city offered no safety, not even in the darkness. Every shadow could conceal a predator, every sound could signal a threat. As I moved cautiously through the western quarter, a sudden noise made me freeze. A group of raiders emerged from a side alley, dragging a young man who had likely ventured out too far in search of food. The man struggled, his face pale and eyes wide with fear, but the raiders were relentless. I pressed myself against a mud wall, heart hammering, willing myself to disappear. In Nubia, invisibility could mean the difference between life and death, stepping forward or even glancing could be fatal. The raiders passed, and I exhaled silently, trying to calm my racing pulse. The night was deceptive, its quietness a veil over lurking dangers. The streets were lined with homes, many with fires flickering inside, casting dancing shadows that could hide either friend or foe. The faint cries of the sick reached my ears, reminding me that disease, invisible yet deadly, was as much a threat as any human attacker. Even the smallest cut, left untreated, could become fatal. Every step had to be deliberate, every glance calculated, every breath measured. I turned toward the river, seeking the faint promise of solace in its waters. The Nile glimmered faintly under the moonlight, its surface deceptively calm. Crocodiles slid silently beneath, predators waiting for the unwary. I knelt to drink carefully, every muscle tensed, knowing that even this simple act could be my undoing. The river, while necessary for life, was a reminder that danger existed even in places that offered sustenance. Disease lingered in every drop, every stagnant pool, every tiny scratch that could become infected. From the corner of my eye, I noticed figures moving stealthily along the opposite bank. My pulse quickened. Were they raiders returning, or scouts from a rival city-state? I could not tell. The threat was real, and one misstep could leave me exposed. I retreated slowly into the shadows, body pressed against the cool mud wall, listening intently for any hint of pursuit. Nubia was merciless, even the careful could be snatched from life in an instant. Further along, a scuffle erupted ahead. Thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to steal his wares in the shadows. Sticks and knives clashed, and shouts echoed through the alleyways. I froze, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would mean almost certain death. Survival required invisibility, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without drawing attention. Each encounter was a test, each decision a matter of life or death. By the time I found a small, shadowed nook to rest briefly, the chill of the night had seeped deep into my bones. My body trembled with exhaustion, my mind replayed every encounter, every threat, every near miss. The city was merciless: raids, thefts, disease, cruelty, and the ever-present danger of slavery had made each moment a challenge to survive. Nubia offered no forgiveness, and even the most cautious could fall prey to fate. I knew the hours ahead would bring more perils, and surviving until dawn would demand every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night deepened, and Kerma seemed to transform into a city of shadows and whispers. Every alley and narrow street became a maze where a single misstep could be fatal. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, dust, and the faint stench of refuse. Even the distant croak of a frog or the rustle of a rat could send my heart racing, each sound amplified in the heavy silence. My muscles ached, my feet throbbed, yet there was no option to rest. Survival demanded constant vigilance, and one lapse could mean instant death. As I moved cautiously along a narrow alley in the western quarter, a sudden commotion made me freeze. Ahead, two men were struggling over a young boy, their hands grasping at him, intent on taking what little he carried. The boy's cries were muffled by the night, yet each one cut sharply into the quiet. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart hammering. In Nubia, intervening was not a choice, even glancing could mark me for capture or worse. Life demanded invisibility and an acceptance of helplessness in the face of cruelty. I crept onward toward the riverbank, hoping for a brief reprieve in the presence of water. The Nile glimmered faintly under the moon, its surface deceptively calm. Crocodiles slid silently beneath, invisible threats ready to strike at any moment. I knelt carefully to drink, aware that the river was both sustenance and hazard. Disease lingered invisibly, carried in the water and in the air, ready to claim life from the slightest cut or careless sip. Even this simple act of drinking was a negotiation with fate, each movement a calculated gamble. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement along the opposite bank. Figures moved stealthily in the shadows, their intentions unclear. Were they raiders returning for captives? Scouts from a rival city-state? My pulse spiked. Every instinct screamed to remain unseen. I retreated slowly into the shadows, pressing my body against the cool mud wall, listening, watching, calculating. Nubia was merciless, even the most careful could be caught in its snare without warning. Further into the alleys, fires flickered in homes, casting dancing, monstrous shadows. The faint cries of the sick echoed, reminders that disease was as lethal as any blade. A minor cut, left untreated, could become fatal. I moved carefully, aware that the city was a minefield of threats. Every step required attention, every glance assessment, every breath controlled. Suddenly, the clash of sticks and knives rang out from nearby. A small group of thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to seize his wares. The air was thick with shouting and fear. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicidal. Survival in Nubia demanded patience, stealth, and the ability to navigate chaos without attracting notice. Each encounter was a test, each decision a matter of life or death. By the time I found a shadowed nook to rest briefly, the chill of night had seeped deep into my bones. My body trembled with exhaustion, my mind replayed every threat, every near miss, every raid I had witnessed. The city was relentless: raids, theft, disease, cruelty, and the ever-present risk of slavery had made every moment a challenge. Nubia offered no mercy, and even the most careful could fall prey to fate. The hours ahead promised even more peril, and surviving until dawn would demand every ounce of instinct, endurance, and luck I could muster. The night had grown colder, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the city of Kerma. The alleys, so familiar during the day, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. Every sound, distant footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the faint splash of the river, made my muscles tense, every nerve alert. Hours of constant vigilance had left me exhausted, yet even a single moment of weakness could be fatal. In Nubia, night offered no safety, only another layer of threats. As I carefully navigated a narrow lane, I heard a commotion ahead. A group of raiders had surrounded a young woman, dragging her roughly from her home. Her cries echoed through the streets, yet no one intervened. I pressed myself flat against the wall, barely daring to breathe. Stepping forward or making any noise could mean immediate death or enslavement. Survival demanded invisibility, patience, and the grim acceptance of helplessness. The raiders moved on, leaving the woman trembling and silent. I exhaled slowly, muscles tight with tension. Even in these quiet moments, danger lingered. The city seemed to breathe around me, a living entity composed of shadows and whispers, always watching, always ready to punish a single misstep. Every alleyway, every door, every shadow held potential threats, from thieves and raiders to disease and starvation. I made my way toward the riverbank, seeking a brief respite in the familiar glimmer of the Nile. The water reflected the pale moonlight, deceptively calm, yet deadly beneath the surface. Crocodiles prowled silently, and disease lingered invisibly in every drop. I cupped my hands to drink, my movements cautious, aware that even this simple act could be perilous. The river, while offering sustenance, was also a reminder that life in Nubia demanded constant awareness. Even a minor wound or exposure could prove fatal. From the far bank, I noticed figures moving through the shadows. My heart raced. Were they raiders returning? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself further into the shadows, moving silently and deliberately, listening intently. Nubia was merciless, even the most cautious could fall prey to fate without warning. As I returned to the alleys, I noticed fires flickering in distant homes, casting dancing shadows that transformed familiar streets into unpredictable mazes. The faint cries of the sick echoed through the night, a chilling reminder that disease could be as deadly as any blade. Even a minor infection could claim life faster than any raider. Every step required careful judgment, every glance assessment, every breath calculated. Suddenly, a clash of weapons erupted nearby. A band of thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to steal his goods in the darkness. Shouts rang out, sticks and knives collided, and fear rippled through the surrounding alleys. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, knowing that to intervene would mean certain death. Survival in Nubia demanded skill, stealth, and the ability to move unnoticed through chaos. Each encounter was a test, each decision potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a narrow, shadowed corner to rest briefly, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. My body trembled, and my mind replayed every threat, every close call, every raid and theft I had witnessed. The city offered no mercy: raids, thefts, disease, violence, and the constant risk of slavery had made each moment a struggle to survive. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful observer could fall prey to fate. The hours ahead promised more peril, and surviving until dawn would require every ounce of instinct, endurance, and luck I possessed. The night had settled into a heavy, almost suffocating darkness, and Kerma's streets had become a maze of shifting shadows. Every alley seemed to twist and turn unexpectedly, hiding dangers behind each corner. My legs ached, my body was stiff, and every step required the utmost caution. The air was thick with smoke from distant fires, the faint stench of refuse, and the unmistakable odor of fear. Even the softest noise, the scuff of a foot, the rustle of leaves, a whisper, could betray me to raiders or soldiers lurking unseen. As I crept through a narrow lane, I suddenly heard shouting. Ahead, a small group of raiders had cornered a merchant and his family. The father brandished a crude spear, but his resistance was futile. The mother clutched her children tightly, sobbing silently, while the attackers ransacked their meager belongings. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart hammering, trying to make myself invisible. In Nubia, even glancing at such scenes could be dangerous. Survival demanded absolute discretion. The raiders disappeared into the shadows, leaving the family shaken and defenseless. I exhaled slowly, muscles tense from the anticipation of a potential encounter. The night, deceptive in its stillness, seemed to breathe around me. Every alley, every doorway, every shadow was a potential trap. The city itself felt alive with danger, reminding me that Nubia offered no forgiveness for carelessness. I moved cautiously toward the riverbank, seeking the faint solace offered by the Nile. The water reflected the pale moonlight, its surface calm but concealing deadly threats. Crocodiles lurked silently beneath, invisible to the eye but lethal in a single strike. I knelt carefully to drink, aware that disease lingered in every drop. Even this simple act could become fatal. Every movement had to be deliberate, measured, calculated. From the corner of my eye, I noticed movement along the opposite bank. Figures moved stealthily in the shadows. My pulse quickened. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I froze, pressed against the cool mud wall, listening and waiting. In Nubia, the line between life and death was thin. One misstep, one noise, one glance could be fatal. Further along, I passed homes with flickering fires, their shadows twisting the alleys into unfamiliar paths. The faint cries of the sick echoed in the night, a chilling reminder that disease was as lethal as any human threat. Even a minor wound, untreated, could become a death sentence. Every step required careful judgment, every glance assessment, every breath controlled. Suddenly, the clash of sticks and knives rang out nearby. A small group of thieves had cornered a lone merchant, attempting to steal his wares. The noise of the struggle echoed through the alleys, and fear radiated from all around. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, knowing that stepping forward would be suicide. Survival demanded stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without being seen. Each encounter tested my skill and instincts, every choice a potential matter of life or death. By the time I found a shadowed nook to rest briefly, exhaustion had taken over my body. My limbs trembled, and my mind replayed every close call, every raid, every threat I had faced throughout the day. The city showed no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present risk of slavery had made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall prey to its dangers. The night was far from over, and surviving until dawn would require every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had thickened, wrapping Kerma in a blanket of oppressive darkness. The alleys, already treacherous, seemed alive, their shadows twisting and stretching with every flicker of distant firelight. My legs ached, my lungs burned from the tension, and every movement had to be calculated. Even the faintest sound, the shuffle of feet, the whisper of wind, the distant splash of the river, could betray me to a lurking predator. Nubia had no mercy for carelessness. As I cautiously navigated a narrow passage, a sudden commotion froze me in place. Ahead, a small band of raiders had surrounded a lone man. He struggled, raising his arms in a futile attempt to defend himself, but the attackers were relentless. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, forcing myself to become invisible. In Nubia, witnessing brutality was unavoidable, intervening was suicide. Survival demanded invisibility, patience, and cold acceptance of helplessness. The raiders vanished into the night, leaving the man stumbling, bruised and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles tense, realizing that even the briefest pause could be fatal. The city's quietness was deceptive, danger lingered in every shadow, every doorway, every step. The streets themselves seemed alive with menace, reminding me that Nubia did not forgive mistakes. I moved toward the riverbank, seeking the slight comfort of the Nile's presence. The water gleamed faintly under the moon, calm yet hiding predators beneath the surface. Crocodiles slipped silently, invisible but lethal. I knelt carefully to drink, conscious of the lurking threat of disease in the water. Every movement had to be deliberate, even a moment's carelessness could be fatal. Survival demanded constant vigilance and calculation. From the corner of my eye, I spotted movement along the far bank. Figures slipped through the shadows, their intentions unclear. My pulse raced. Were they raiders returning for captives? Scouts from rival city-states? I pressed myself into the shadows, holding my breath, listening intently. Nubia was merciless, even the most careful could be ensnared by fate. The alleyways were a maze of flickering firelight and deep shadows. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease was as deadly as any human attacker. A minor wound, unnoticed, could mean death. Each step demanded awareness, each glance assessment, each breath controlled. Suddenly, the clash of weapons shattered the night. Thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to steal his goods. Sticks clashed against knives, shouts echoed, and fear rippled through the surrounding alleys. I pressed myself against a wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicide. Survival demanded stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without drawing attention. Every encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a small, shadowed corner to rest briefly, my body trembled with exhaustion. My mind replayed each raid, each theft, each encounter. The city was merciless, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present threat of slavery had made each moment a struggle to survive. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall prey to its dangers. The night stretched on, full of unseen threats, and surviving until dawn required every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I could muster. The night had reached a sinister stillness, yet the city of Kerma was anything but safe. The alleys, twisted and narrow, seemed alive, each shadow a potential hiding place for raiders, thieves, or worse. My legs were stiff, my body heavy with exhaustion, but stopping was not an option. Every sound, the soft scrape of a foot, the murmur of distant voices, the rustle of a leaf, made me flinch. In Nubia, one careless move, one misstep, could end life in an instant. As I edged along a dimly lit street, a sudden shout made me freeze. Ahead, two men were attacking a young merchant, attempting to steal his wares. The merchant struggled, swinging a wooden stick, but the attackers were ruthless. I pressed myself against the wall, forcing myself into invisibility. Intervening would be suicide. Life in Nubia demanded patience, observation, and the grim acceptance of helplessness. The attackers disappeared into the night, leaving the merchant bruised and frightened. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my pounding heart. The quiet of the night was deceptive, every shadow, every flicker of movement, could signal danger. The city itself felt like a predator, always alert, always ready to claim the careless. Each alleyway, every corner, every doorway was a potential death trap. I moved toward the riverbank, seeking the faint solace offered by the Nile. The water shimmered under the moonlight, its surface calm but hiding dangers beneath. Crocodiles slipped silently through the dark water, waiting for the unwary. I knelt cautiously to drink, conscious of the invisible threat of disease in the water. Even a simple act could be deadly. Each movement required precision, vigilance, and constant calculation. Survival in Nubia left no room for error. From the corner of my eye, I spotted movement along the far bank. Shadows shifted and figures moved stealthily. Were they raiders returning or scouts from rival city-states? My pulse surged. I pressed myself further into the shadows, silent and tense. Nubia was merciless, even the most careful could be ensnared by chance. The alleys, lit by flickering fires from distant homes, cast monstrous shadows. The faint cries of the sick carried through the night, a chilling reminder that disease could be as lethal as any raider or soldier. Even a minor wound could prove fatal. Each step, each glance, each breath had to be calculated. Suddenly, the clash of sticks and knives rang out nearby. A group of thieves had cornered a lone merchant, trying to seize his goods. The sounds of struggle echoed through the streets, and fear rippled through the city. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicidal. Survival demanded skill, stealth, and the ability to navigate chaos without drawing attention. Every encounter was a test, each choice a potential matter of life or death. By the time I found a small, shadowed nook to rest briefly, exhaustion had taken hold. My body trembled, my mind replayed each threat, each raid, each close encounter. The city showed no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present risk of slavery had made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched on, heavy and full of unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of instinct, skill, and luck I possessed. The night had grown heavier, almost suffocating, and the streets of Kerma seemed transformed into a perilous maze. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally under the flickering light of distant fires. Every corner, every doorway, every alley was fraught with unseen danger. My legs ached from hours of careful movement, my body was stiff, and exhaustion weighed on my mind, yet stopping was not an option. One lapse, one misstep, could mean instant death. In Nubia, survival demanded constant vigilance. As I cautiously crept through a narrow lane, a sudden shout froze me. Ahead, a group of raiders had cornered a family. The father raised a crude spear in desperate defense, but the attackers pressed forward relentlessly. The mother clutched her children tightly, sobbing softly. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, forcing myself into invisibility. To intervene would have been suicide. Life in Nubia required patience, observation, and grim acceptance of helplessness. Once the raiders disappeared into the shadows, leaving the family shaken and terrified, I exhaled slowly, muscles taut from tension. The quiet of the night was deceptive. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of movement could conceal a threat. The city itself felt alive, watching, ready to punish the careless. Each alleyway, each doorway, each narrow passage was a potential trap, waiting for one wrong move. I moved toward the riverbank, seeking a small comfort in the presence of water. The Nile shimmered under the moonlight, calm yet deadly beneath the surface. Crocodiles lurked silently, invisible predators ready to strike. I knelt carefully to drink, aware that disease lingered in every drop. Even a simple act could become a deadly gamble. Every motion, every breath had to be deliberate, measured, and precise. Survival demanded constant calculation. From the far bank, I saw shadowy figures moving stealthily. My pulse quickened. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I froze, pressed against the cool mud wall, listening intently. Nubia was unforgiving, even the most careful could be caught in an instant. The alleys, illuminated intermittently by flickering fires, cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease was as deadly as any human threat. A minor infection, untreated, could be fatal. Each step required judgment, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, the clash of sticks and knives echoed nearby. A small band of thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to steal his goods. Shouts and the sounds of struggle reverberated through the streets. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, knowing that any intervention would mean certain death. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without drawing attention. Every encounter was a test, each choice a matter of life or death. By the time I found a shadowed nook to rest briefly, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. My body trembled, my mind replayed every close encounter, every raid, every threat. The city offered no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the constant risk of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall prey to fate. The night stretched on, heavy and full of unseen dangers, and surviving until dawn required every ounce of instinct, skill, and luck I possessed. The night had become almost suffocating, the moonlight barely piercing the heavy darkness that enveloped Kerma. Every alley seemed alive, every shadow a potential threat. My body ached from hours of careful movement, muscles stiff, and lungs burning from shallow, tense breaths. Rest was impossible, not when every step could bring death, capture, or disease. Survival demanded relentless vigilance, sharp instincts, and a measure of luck that was often in short supply. As I crept cautiously through the western quarter, a sudden shout made me freeze. Ahead, a small band of raiders had trapped a man near his home, attempting to seize him. The man struggled, brandishing a wooden staff, but the attackers were merciless. I flattened myself against the mud wall, forcing myself into invisibility. In Nubia, one wrong move, one glance, could mean instant death. Observing, remaining silent, and waiting for danger to pass was often the only path to survival. The raiders moved on, leaving the man bruised, trembling, and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles tense, knowing that the quiet of the night was deceptive. Danger lurked in every shadow, every doorway, every flicker of firelight. The city itself felt alive, a predator moving silently, ready to claim those who faltered. Every step had to be deliberate, every glance assessed, every breath measured. I moved toward the riverbank, seeking the faint solace of the Nile. The water gleamed dimly under the moonlight, deceptively calm, yet deadly beneath its surface. Crocodiles slipped silently through the dark water, invisible predators lying in wait. I knelt carefully to drink, aware that the river offered both sustenance and invisible danger. Disease lingered in every drop, and a single misstep could be fatal. Survival demanded constant calculation, vigilance, and control over every motion. From the far bank, shadows moved subtly. Figures slipped along the opposite shore, their intentions unclear. My pulse quickened. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from rival city-states? I pressed myself further into the darkness, muscles coiled, senses alert. Nubia was merciless, even the most cautious could fall prey to fate without warning. The alleys twisted and turned, illuminated intermittently by distant fires that cast monstrous shadows. The faint cries of the sick echoed in the night, a chilling reminder that disease could claim life as swiftly as any blade. Even a minor wound, untreated, could be fatal. Each step required awareness, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, a clash of metal and shouts broke the night. A group of thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to seize his wares. Sticks and knives collided, echoes reverberating through the narrow streets. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, knowing that stepping forward would mean certain death. Survival required patience, stealth, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Each encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a narrow, shadowed nook to rest, the chill of the night had settled deep into my bones. My body trembled from exhaustion, my mind replayed every close call, every raid, every threat. The city offered no mercy, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the omnipresent threat of slavery made survival a constant struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched on, dense with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I could summon. The night pressed down heavily, and Kerma had become a city of shifting shadows and hidden threats. Every alley seemed unfamiliar, even ones I had passed dozens of times during daylight. The faint flicker of distant fires threw monstrous shapes across the walls, turning even the smallest corners into potential death traps. My legs were sore, my body exhausted, and yet I could not stop. In Nubia, rest was a luxury that could easily lead to death. Every step demanded precision, every sound scrutiny, every breath caution. As I edged through a narrow lane, a sudden scream shattered the oppressive quiet. Ahead, a group of raiders had cornered a man and a young boy, attempting to steal whatever meager possessions they carried. The man raised a crude spear in desperate defense, but the attackers paid him no mind. The boy's face was pale with terror, his small hands clenching tightly to a stolen loaf of bread. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart hammering, willing myself into invisibility. In Nubia, even glancing at danger could mark one for death. Survival required observation, patience, and grim acceptance. The raiders eventually departed, leaving the man and boy shaken and trembling. I exhaled, muscles tight with tension. The night's deceptive quiet made every sound, every flicker of movement, a potential threat. The city itself felt alive, a predator stalking those who faltered. Every alley, every doorway, every shadow was a potential trap, waiting for one misstep. I crept toward the riverbank, seeking the faint reassurance of the Nile's presence. The water gleamed dimly under the moonlight, its calm surface hiding crocodiles lurking beneath. I knelt cautiously to drink, aware that disease lingered in every drop. Even this simple act carried risk, a single careless movement could be fatal. Survival demanded constant calculation, careful movement, and unbroken vigilance. From the far bank, I noticed shadows slipping through the darkness. Figures moved with purpose, their intentions unclear. My pulse surged. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from rival city-states? I pressed myself further into the shadows, muscles coiled, senses alert. Nubia was merciless, even the most cautious could fall prey to fate. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated intermittently by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could be as deadly as human attackers. Even a minor cut, left untreated, could become fatal. Each step required awareness, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, the clash of weapons rang out nearby. Thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to seize his wares. The sounds of struggle echoed through the alleys. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, knowing that intervening would be suicide. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without being seen. Every encounter was a test, each decision a potential matter of life or death. By the time I found a narrow, shadowed corner to rest briefly, the chill of the night had seeped deep into my bones. My body trembled from exhaustion, my mind replayed every danger, every near miss, every raid. Kerma offered no mercy, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present threat of slavery made survival a constant struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched endlessly, thick with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night grew darker, heavier, pressing down on the city like an unseen weight. Kerma had become a maze of danger, every alley and narrow street hiding threats both human and natural. My body ached from hours of tension, muscles stiff, and my mind was exhausted from constant vigilance. Yet even in this state, there was no rest. In Nubia, a single misstep, a single glance, a single noise could mean death. Survival demanded sharp instincts, patience, and luck. As I crept through a dimly lit lane, a sudden shout cut through the stillness. Ahead, a small band of raiders had cornered a young woman, attempting to drag her into the shadows. She struggled, her cries muffled but piercing the night. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart pounding, holding my breath. Any interference, even accidental, could mark me for capture or death. In Nubia, invisibility was often the only defense. The raiders moved on, leaving her trembling and silent. I exhaled slowly, muscles tight from tension. Even in moments of temporary calm, the night was deceptive. Every flicker of firelight, every distant sound, every shifting shadow could conceal a threat. The city itself seemed alive, a predator watching and waiting. Each corner, every doorway, every alley could hide death. I made my way toward the riverbank, seeking the faint comfort of the Nile. The water gleamed dimly under the moonlight, calm yet deadly beneath the surface. Crocodiles slipped silently through the dark waters, waiting for an unobservant prey. I knelt carefully to drink, mindful of the disease that lingered invisibly in the water. Even this simple act carried risk, one careless move could be fatal. Survival required calculation, vigilance, and control over every motion. From the opposite bank, shadows shifted. Figures moved purposefully, yet silently. My pulse quickened. Were they raiders returning? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself into the shadows, muscles tense, senses alert. Nubia was unforgiving, even the most careful could be ensnared by fate without warning. The alleys twisted under the flickering light of distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could kill as surely as any raider. Even a minor infection, untreated, could claim a life in hours. Each step demanded awareness, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, the clash of weapons erupted nearby. A group of thieves had cornered a merchant, trying to seize his wares. The noise of the struggle echoed through the narrow streets. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that intervention would be suicide. Survival demanded stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Every encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a small, shadowed nook to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on my body. My limbs trembled, and my mind replayed every close call, every threat, every raid. Kerma offered no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present threat of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched on, heavy with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn required every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had deepened into a dense, almost tangible darkness. Kerma's streets were silent, yet every alley held the promise of violence, theft, or death. The city felt alive in its own sinister way, every shadow a potential trap, every flicker of firelight a warning. My legs were stiff and sore, my body trembling from exhaustion, yet I could not pause. In Nubia, even a brief moment of inattention could be fatal. Survival demanded constant vigilance, careful calculation, and an unwavering instinct for danger. As I crept through a narrow lane, a sudden shout made my heart leap. A small group of raiders had cornered a lone man, attempting to strip him of his few possessions. The man struggled, brandishing a crude spear, but the attackers pressed forward without hesitation. I flattened myself against the wall, holding my breath. In Nubia, to intervene meant certain death. Observing silently, waiting for the danger to pass, was often the only way to survive. The raiders eventually moved on, leaving the man bruised, frightened, and bleeding. I exhaled slowly, muscles tense. The quiet of the night was deceptive. Every sound, every flicker of movement, every shadow could conceal lethal intent. The city itself seemed aware, a predator stalking those who faltered. Each doorway, every alley, every corner was a potential death trap, waiting for one wrong move. I made my way toward the riverbank, seeking the small comfort of the Nile. Its surface glimmered faintly under the moonlight, calm yet deadly. Crocodiles glided silently beneath, invisible hunters ready to strike. I knelt carefully to drink, aware that disease lingered invisibly in the water. Even the simplest act could be deadly. Survival required precision, vigilance, and constant calculation. From the far bank, I noticed figures moving stealthily through the shadows. My pulse surged. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself further into the darkness, senses alert, muscles coiled for instant flight. Nubia did not forgive carelessness, even the most cautious could be ensnared by fate. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated intermittently by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease was as deadly as any human threat. A minor wound, left untreated, could be fatal. Each step demanded awareness, each glance assessment, each breath controlled. Suddenly, the clash of weapons echoed nearby. Thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to seize his goods. Shouts and the sounds of struggle reverberated through the streets. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, knowing that to intervene would be suicide. Survival demanded stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without drawing attention. Every encounter was a test, each decision potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a small, shadowed corner to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My body trembled, my mind replayed every threat, every close call, every raid. Kerma offered no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present threat of slavery had made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched endlessly, full of unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had grown almost suffocating, thick with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Kerma had become a labyrinth of peril, every alley and narrow street hiding dangers both human and unseen. My muscles screamed from exhaustion, my body was tense from hours of vigilance, yet I could not afford to stop. In Nubia, rest was a luxury that could easily turn into a death sentence. Every step, every glance, every breath had to be precise. As I crept along a dimly lit lane, a sudden shout cut through the silence. Ahead, a group of raiders had cornered a man near his home, attempting to seize him and his few possessions. The man struggled, swinging a crude spear, but the attackers were merciless. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart pounding, willing myself into invisibility. In Nubia, even glancing at danger could mark one for death. Observing silently and waiting for the threat to pass was often the only way to survive. Once the raiders moved on, leaving the man bruised and shaken, I exhaled slowly, muscles taut with tension. The quiet of the night was deceptive, every shadow, every sound, every flicker of firelight could conceal a lethal threat. The city itself seemed alive, a predator watching and waiting. Each doorway, every alley, every corner could hide death. I made my way toward the riverbank, seeking the faint comfort of the Nile. Its surface shimmered faintly under the moonlight, deceptively calm. Crocodiles slid silently beneath the water, invisible predators ready to strike. I knelt carefully to drink, aware of the invisible danger of disease in the water. Even this simple act carried risk, one careless move could be fatal. Survival demanded vigilance, calculation, and control over every motion. From the far bank, shadows shifted. Figures moved stealthily, their intentions unclear. My pulse surged. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, muscles coiled, senses alert. Nubia was unforgiving, even the most careful could fall prey to fate. The alleys twisted unpredictably under the flickering light of distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could kill as swiftly as any human attacker. Even a minor wound, untreated, could be fatal. Each step required awareness, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, the clash of weapons erupted nearby. Thieves had cornered a merchant, trying to seize his goods. The sounds of struggle echoed through the narrow streets, and fear radiated outward. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicide. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos without being seen. Every encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a narrow, shadowed nook to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My limbs trembled, my mind replayed every danger, every raid, every near miss. The city offered no mercy, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present threat of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched on, heavy and thick with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn required every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had become almost unbearable, thick and heavy, pressing down on Kerma like a living weight. Every street, every alley, every shadow seemed alive with danger. My muscles ached from hours of careful, tense movement, my body trembling from exhaustion, yet I could not stop. In Nubia, a single misstep, a single glance, or a single misjudgment could mean instant death. Survival demanded vigilance, patience, and an unrelenting instinct for danger. As I moved cautiously through a dim alley, a sudden scream pierced the darkness. Ahead, a small band of raiders had cornered a young man. He struggled, brandishing a crude spear, but the attackers were relentless. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart hammering, forcing myself into invisibility. In Nubia, to intervene would be suicide. Survival required observation, patience, and the grim acceptance of helplessness. The raiders moved on eventually, leaving the man bruised, bleeding, and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles taut, aware that even brief moments of calm were deceptive. Danger lurked in every shadow, every doorway, every flicker of firelight. The city itself seemed alive, a predator stalking those who faltered. Each alleyway, every corner, every narrow passage was a potential death trap. I made my way toward the riverbank, seeking the faint comfort of the Nile. Its surface shimmered dimly under the moonlight, calm yet deadly beneath. Crocodiles slid silently through the dark waters, unseen but lethal. I knelt cautiously to drink, conscious of the invisible threat of disease in the water. Even the simplest act could be deadly, every motion had to be deliberate, every movement precise. Survival demanded constant calculation. From the far bank, I noticed figures slipping through the shadows. My pulse surged. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the darkness, senses alert, muscles coiled. Nubia was merciless, even the most careful could be ensnared by chance. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could strike as surely as human violence. Even a minor wound, left untreated, could become fatal. Each step required awareness, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, the clash of metal and shouts broke the night's fragile silence. Thieves had cornered a merchant, trying to steal his wares. The struggle echoed through the narrow streets, sending fear rippling outward. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would mean certain death. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Every encounter was a test, each decision potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a small shadowed nook to rest briefly, exhaustion had overtaken my body. My limbs trembled, my mind replayed every threat, every close call, every raid. Kerma offered no mercy, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present danger of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its perils. The night stretched on, heavy and thick with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn required every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I could muster. The night had thickened into a suffocating darkness, blanketing Kerma in a silence that was almost unbearable. Every alley and narrow street seemed alive with hidden threats. My body ached from exhaustion, my muscles stiff from hours of tense movement, yet stopping was impossible. In Nubia, even a brief pause could lead to death. Survival demanded unbroken vigilance, precise movements, and constant calculation. As I crept through a narrow lane, a sudden scream made my blood run cold. Ahead, a group of raiders had trapped a young woman, dragging her violently toward the shadows. Her muffled cries echoed through the alleys. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, willing myself into invisibility. Any interference would have been fatal. In Nubia, invisibility and silence were often the only paths to survival. The attackers moved on, leaving the woman trembling and silent. I exhaled slowly, tension coiling and uncoiling in my muscles. Even the quiet moments of the night were deceptive. Every flicker of firelight, every distant sound, every movement in the shadows could conceal a lethal threat. The city itself felt alive, watching, ready to punish the careless. Each alley, every doorway, every shadow was a potential death trap. I continued toward the riverbank, seeking the slight comfort of the Nile. The water shimmered faintly under the moonlight, calm yet deadly. Crocodiles slid silently beneath the surface, invisible but lethal. I knelt cautiously to drink, aware that disease lingered in every drop. Even a simple act carried risk. One careless movement could be fatal. Survival required constant awareness, careful calculation, and control over every motion. From the opposite bank, shadows shifted. Figures moved with stealth and purpose. My pulse surged. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself further into the darkness, senses sharp, muscles coiled. Nubia was merciless, even the most careful could fall victim to fate. The alleys twisted unpredictably, lit sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could kill as surely as any human attacker. A minor wound, left untreated, could claim life in hours. Every step demanded awareness, each glance assessment, each breath measured. Suddenly, the clash of metal rang out nearby. Thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to steal his goods. Shouts and struggle echoed through the narrow streets. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that intervening would mean certain death. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to move unseen through chaos. Every encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a shadowed nook to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My body trembled, my mind replayed every danger, every near miss, every raid. Kerma offered no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the constant threat of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night stretched endlessly, thick with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I could muster. The night had thickened into an almost suffocating darkness, and Kerma had become a labyrinth of threats. Every alley, every shadow, every flicker of firelight held danger. My body ached from hours of tense movement, muscles stiff and trembling, yet stopping was not an option. In Nubia, a single misstep could end a life instantly. Survival demanded unbroken vigilance, acute awareness, and a constant readiness for sudden violence. As I crept through a narrow, dimly lit street, a sudden cry tore through the night. Ahead, a group of raiders had cornered a merchant, attempting to rob him. The man struggled with a crude spear, but the attackers pressed relentlessly. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, holding my breath. Any interference could mean death. In Nubia, silence and invisibility were often the only shields against fate. The raiders disappeared into the shadows, leaving the merchant bruised and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles still tense, aware that the city itself seemed alive, watching, judging, ready to punish the slightest lapse. Each alley, each doorway, each flicker of light could conceal deadly intent. The night was deceptive, even moments of apparent calm were laden with peril. I made my way toward the riverbank, seeking the faint comfort of the Nile's presence. The water gleamed dimly under the moonlight, serene yet lethal. Crocodiles moved silently beneath the surface, invisible predators. I knelt cautiously to drink, mindful of disease lingering in the water. Even a small lapse in caution could be fatal. Every motion, every step, every breath demanded calculation and control. From across the river, shadows shifted. Figures moved stealthily, their intentions unknown. My pulse surged. Were they raiders returning? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the darkness, senses alert, muscles coiled for instant flight. Nubia was unforgiving, even the most careful could be ensnared by fate without warning. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick echoed, a grim reminder that disease could be as deadly as any human attacker. A minor wound, left untreated, could become fatal in hours. Each step required awareness, each glance careful, each breath measured. Suddenly, the clash of metal and the shouts of struggle erupted nearby. Thieves had cornered a young man, trying to seize his belongings. The sounds of violence reverberated through the alleys. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that stepping forward would be suicide. Survival required patience, stealth, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Each encounter was a test, each decision a matter of life or death. By the time I found a shadowed corner to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My body trembled, my mind replayed every threat, every raid, every close call. Kerma offered no mercy: raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present danger of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its perils. The night stretched endlessly, heavy with unseen dangers, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had turned into a thick, suffocating cloak over Kerma, and the city had transformed into a trap-laden maze. Every alley and shadow seemed to harbor danger, ready to strike without warning. My body ached from hours of tense movement, muscles trembling with fatigue, yet I could not stop. In Nubia, one wrong move could end life instantly. Survival required unwavering vigilance, acute awareness, and readiness to respond to sudden threats. As I crept along a narrow lane, a scream tore through the darkness. A group of raiders had cornered a young woman, attempting to drag her into the shadows. Her muffled cries echoed against the walls. I pressed myself flat against the mud wall, heart hammering, willing myself into invisibility. Intervening would have been suicide. In Nubia, silence and invisibility were often the only shields against death. The attackers vanished into the darkness, leaving her trembling and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles coiled from tension. Even moments of apparent calm were deceptive. Every flicker of firelight, every sound, every shadow could conceal a deadly threat. The city itself felt alive, a predator stalking the unwary. Each corner, every doorway, every alleyway could hide death. I moved toward the riverbank, seeking the faint solace of the Nile. Its surface shimmered faintly in the moonlight, calm but deadly beneath. Crocodiles glided silently, invisible predators waiting for the unwary. I knelt cautiously to drink, aware that disease lingered in the water. Even the simplest act could be fatal. Every motion, every step, every breath required careful calculation. From across the river, shadows moved stealthily. Figures slipped through the darkness, their intentions unclear. My pulse quickened. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, senses sharp, muscles coiled for instant flight. Nubia was merciless, even the most cautious could fall victim to fate. The alleys twisted unpredictably, lit sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could strike as swiftly as human attackers. Even a minor injury, left untreated, could be fatal in hours. Each step demanded awareness, each glance careful, each breath controlled. Suddenly, a clash of metal and shouts erupted nearby. Thieves had cornered a merchant, attempting to steal his goods. The sounds of struggle echoed through the narrow streets. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicide. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to move unseen through chaos. Each encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a shadowed corner to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My limbs trembled, and my mind replayed every threat, every raid, every close call. Kerma offered no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present danger of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its perils. The night stretched endlessly, heavy and full of unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had reached its most perilous point, and Kerma had transformed into a landscape of shadows and hidden dangers. Every street, every alley, every flicker of firelight seemed to conceal potential death. My muscles ached from hours of tense movement, my body trembling from exhaustion, yet I could not stop. In Nubia, even a moment's lapse in attention could be fatal. Survival demanded relentless vigilance, sharp instincts, and the constant ability to anticipate danger. As I moved cautiously through a narrow alley, a sudden scream split the night. Ahead, a group of raiders had trapped a young merchant, attempting to seize his meager possessions. The man swung a crude spear desperately, but the attackers pressed forward without mercy. I flattened myself against the wall, heart hammering, holding my breath. Any interference could have been my death. In Nubia, stealth, patience, and careful observation were often the only shields against fatal consequences. The raiders eventually disappeared, leaving the merchant bruised, bleeding, and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles tight with tension. Even brief moments of apparent calm were deceptive. Every flicker of light, every distant sound, every movement in the shadows could conceal lethal intent. The city itself felt alive, stalking, testing, punishing the careless. Each alleyway, every doorway, every corner could be a death trap. I pressed on toward the riverbank, seeking the small comfort of the Nile. Its surface shimmered faintly in the moonlight, calm yet deadly. Crocodiles glided silently beneath the water, unseen hunters waiting for the unwary. I knelt cautiously to drink, aware of the disease that lurked in every drop. Even this simple act carried risk, one careless motion could be fatal. Survival required constant awareness and precise control over every movement. From the far bank, shadows shifted. Figures moved stealthily, their intentions unclear. My pulse quickened. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, senses alert, muscles coiled for instant flight. Nubia was merciless, even the most careful could fall prey to fate without warning. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could strike as swiftly as any human attacker. Even a minor wound, left untreated, could become fatal. Each step demanded awareness, each glance careful, each breath measured. Suddenly, the clash of metal and shouts erupted nearby. Thieves had cornered another merchant, attempting to seize his goods. The sounds of struggle echoed through the narrow streets, sending a chill through me. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that stepping forward would be suicide. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Every encounter was a test, each choice potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a shadowed nook to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My body trembled, my mind replayed every threat, every raid, every near miss. Kerma offered no mercy. Raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the ever-present danger of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its perils. The night stretched endlessly, dense with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I possessed. The night had become an oppressive, almost living presence, pressing down on Kerma with a weight that made every movement feel dangerous. The city seemed transformed, each alley and street a gauntlet of threats. My muscles burned from hours of constant tension, my body shivering with fatigue, yet I could not stop. In Nubia, even a single lapse, a misstep, a sound, a glance, could be fatal. Survival demanded razor-sharp focus, careful calculation, and a readiness to act instantly. As I crept through a twisting alley, a sudden scream tore through the darkness. Ahead, a small band of raiders had cornered a man carrying goods too valuable for his safety. He swung a crude spear in desperation, but the attackers pressed forward relentlessly. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart hammering, forcing myself into invisibility. Any interference would have been death. In Nubia, observation, patience, and silence were often the only defenses against fate. The raiders finally moved on, leaving the man bruised, frightened, and wounded. I exhaled slowly, muscles tight with tension, aware that even moments of calm were deceiving. Every flicker of firelight, every sound, every shadow could conceal lethal intent. The city itself seemed alive, a predator stalking the unwary. Each alley, every doorway, every corner was a potential death trap. I moved toward the riverbank, seeking the faint comfort of the Nile. Its surface shimmered faintly in the moonlight, calm yet lethal. Crocodiles glided silently beneath the water, invisible hunters waiting for the unwary. I knelt cautiously to drink, conscious of the disease lurking in the water. Even a simple act could be fatal, every motion, every step, every breath demanded calculation and care. From across the river, shadows shifted. Figures moved stealthily, their intentions unclear. My pulse surged. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the darkness, senses alert, muscles coiled for instant flight. Nubia was merciless, even the most cautious could be ensnared by fate without warning. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could strike as swiftly as human attackers. Even a minor injury, untreated, could be fatal in hours. Each step required awareness, each glance assessment, each breath measured. Suddenly, the clash of metal and shouted curses erupted nearby. Thieves had cornered another merchant, trying to seize his wares. The sounds of struggle echoed through the alleys, sending fear rippling outward. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicide. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Every encounter was a test, each decision potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a small, shadowed nook to rest, exhaustion had nearly consumed me. My limbs trembled, my mind replayed every threat, every raid, every near miss. Kerma offered no mercy, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the constant danger of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its perils. The night stretched endlessly, dense with unseen dangers, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I could muster. The night was drawing toward its end, but Kerma offered no relief. The darkness had deepened into a weight pressing down on every street, every alley, every corner. My body ached from hours of relentless tension, muscles stiff and trembling, yet stopping was not an option. In Nubia, even a brief pause could be fatal. Survival demanded unbroken attention, sharp instincts, and constant awareness of every sound, movement, and shadow. As I moved cautiously through a narrow lane, a sudden scream shattered the fragile quiet. Ahead, raiders had cornered a merchant, intent on stripping him of his belongings. The man swung a crude spear desperately, but the attackers pressed forward without mercy. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart hammering, forcing myself into invisibility. Any interference would have meant certain death. In Nubia, patience, observation, and silence were often the only defenses. The raiders eventually left, and the merchant stumbled away, bruised and terrified. I exhaled slowly, muscles tight from tension, aware that even moments of apparent calm were deceptive. Every flicker of firelight, every distant sound, every shadow could hide lethal intent. The city seemed alive, a predator stalking the unwary. Each alleyway, every doorway, every corner could conceal death. I continued toward the riverbank, seeking the faint comfort of the Nile. Its surface shimmered faintly in the moonlight, serene yet deadly. Crocodiles slid silently beneath the water, invisible predators waiting for the careless. I knelt carefully to drink, mindful of disease lurking in the river. Even the simplest act could be fatal, every motion, every step, every breath demanded precision and awareness. From across the river, shadows moved stealthily. Figures slipped through the darkness, their intentions unknown. My pulse quickened. Were they returning raiders? Scouts from a rival city-state? I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, senses alert, muscles coiled for flight. Nubia was merciless, even the most cautious could be ensnared by fate without warning. The alleys twisted unpredictably, illuminated sporadically by distant fires. The faint cries of the sick reminded me that disease could strike as swiftly as any human attacker. Even a minor wound, untreated, could become fatal in hours. Each step required awareness, each glance assessment, each breath careful control. Suddenly, the clash of metal and shouted curses erupted nearby. Thieves had cornered another merchant, trying to seize his goods. The sounds of struggle reverberated through the streets, sending fear rippling outward. I pressed myself flat against the wall, heart racing, knowing that to intervene would be suicide. Survival required stealth, patience, and the ability to navigate chaos unseen. Each encounter was a test, every decision potentially the difference between life and death. By the time I found a shadowed corner to rest, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My limbs trembled, my mind replayed every threat, every raid, every near miss. Kerma offered no mercy, raiders, disease, cruelty, theft, and the constant danger of slavery made survival a relentless struggle. Nubia did not forgive weakness, and even the most careful could fall victim to its dangers. The night seemed endless, thick with unseen threats, and surviving until dawn demanded every ounce of skill, instinct, and luck I could summon. The first light of dawn crept slowly over Kerma, pale and uncertain, like a promise that survival was still possible. The city, once a suffocating labyrinth of shadows, thieves, and unseen dangers, seemed momentarily less hostile, yet the weight of the night's terrors still pressed upon me. My body was exhausted, every muscle trembling, my limbs weak from hours of fleeing, hiding, and carefully calculated movements. Yet I had survived. The streets were quiet, though the echoes of the night lingered. Broken carts, the faint bloodstains of the wounded, and the distant cries of those who had fallen reminded me that survival in Nubia was a razor's edge. One wrong choice, one misstep, could have ended everything. The night had tested every instinct, every reflex, every ounce of patience and vigilance. I had witnessed the cruelty of raiders, the indiscriminate grip of disease, the omnipresent threat of slavery, and the ever-watchful eyes of rival city-states. Each moment had been a fight for life, a negotiation with death itself. As I moved cautiously along the riverbank, the Nile glimmered under the morning sun, deceptively calm. Crocodiles still lurked beneath the water, unseen predators that reminded me that danger never fully vanished. I paused, drinking slowly, savoring the small victory of continued existence. The water was cool against my lips, and the steady rhythm of the river offered a rare sense of continuity amid the chaos. From the far bank, faint movements caught my eye. Shadows shifted, but daylight revealed nothing. Perhaps raiders had retreated, perhaps the city's constant dangers would rise again. The uncertainty remained, but for now, I was alive. Each cautious step forward reinforced a simple truth: in Nubia, life was fragile, fleeting, and precious. Survival was not granted, it was earned, moment by moment, through vigilance, courage, and a relentless will to endure. The alleys, once menacing, now seemed less threatening in the daylight, though the scars of the night remained visible: broken pottery, charred remnants of fires, and the silent forms of those who had not survived. The cries of the sick had quieted, but the threat of disease lingered, invisible but deadly. Every minor injury, every exposure to unsanitary conditions, could still claim life in the hours to come. I paused near the market square, now illuminated by the rising sun. Merchants cautiously emerged, counting losses, repairing stalls, and exchanging wary glances. The city slowly came alive again, but the lessons of the night lingered in every corner, every face, every shadow. Survival had been a careful dance, balancing risk and observation, patience and action. It was not a victory, but a temporary reprieve, a fragile breathing space in a world defined by peril. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, golden beams across the streets of Kerma, I felt a momentary sense of relief. I had survived the night, lived through the dangers of raiders, disease, cruelty, and the ever-present threat of slavery. Yet I knew this respite was temporary. Nubia did not forgive weakness. Life here demanded constant awareness, constant vigilance, and constant courage. One day's survival was only a single step in a lifetime of peril. And so, as dawn painted the city in gold and shadow, I moved forward, alive but wary, carrying the heavy knowledge that in Nubia, life was never guaranteed, and death waited patiently in every corner, ready to claim those who faltered. One day had passed, and I had survived, but barely.